How do organizations across Ontario's youth sector experience and conduct evaluation? What are the challenges and opportunities of doing research and evaluation in the different scales that we work, so small and large scale youth sector organizations? What are the strengths and gaps of research and evaluation capacity across the sector? And what promising evaluation and research practices exist within the sector? Our webinar today begins with a presentation on the study and our findings from our Director of Research and Evaluation, Alexander Lovell. Following Alexander's presentation, we will hear perspectives of 4 panelists, which you see here, who represent diverse youth sector stakeholder positions. As I said, this will be followed by a question and answer period where you can offer your feedback on the key messages and recommendations in the report. I'll provide the bios for our presenters following Alexander's presentation, but right now I'll introduce Alexander Lovell, our Director of Research and Evaluation. Alexander is a geographer with many years of experience researching issues related to youth, community health, and well-being. He has authored and co-authored 7 peer-reviewed articles concerning ethnic enclaves, immigration, and diasporas, and has led community-based projects on health and social services. Welcome, Alexander.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. As Rebecca was saying, my name is Alexander Lovell, and I'm the Director of Research and Evaluation at YouthREX. So we're pleased today to present the findings from our new report, Beyond Measure, Evaluation and Action in Ontario's Youth Sector. The focus of this study is on evaluation capacity and based around some big questions. What are the issues that youth serving programs face with doing evaluation? What are the ways that organizations, programs, and projects navigate the politics of evaluation? And what are types and approaches to program evaluation that are happening across the sector? YouthREX, as you probably know, and Rebecca has mentioned, primarily focuses on working with grassroots youth serving organizations. Because of this, we were interested in exploring the issues facing small organizations and initiatives that are often with many financial constraints, typically providing programs and services without core funding, dedicated evaluation staff, and many times working through the efforts of volunteers and part-time staff. So you probably all have an image in your mind of what we're talking about in terms of this. Some of the challenges that they're facing may be more focused on program delivery, but in this case, we really wanted to get a sense of what the issues were when it came to reporting and using evaluation. These issues are very important to us, and we definitely believe they should be equally important in the discussions among policymakers, funders, other capacity building organizations such as yourself, and of course among others in the sector. We know that they are in terms of when we have discussions with all different groups as we engage across the province. So accordingly, this study focused on comparing, looking at the issues that are facing grassroots organizations and comparing them with the issues facing mainstream organizations. We know that these are contentious concepts and definitely not easy to define. We undertook this project by first trying to examine the literature around how you even go about defining the difference between these two kind of types of programs in terms of their capacity. And we also, of course, engage with people and sort of get their perspective on what they felt was distinct about the grassroots sector compared with mainstream organizations. So between looking at literature and also having discussions, we were able to get a sense of what it really means to be grassroots. But of course, it's challenging. So for us, we really came to the understanding that it's about issues regarding core funding, the funding that allows organizations to be able to have full-time, permanent administrative staff, well-resourced in terms of some of the technological needs, all the infrastructure in terms of physical infrastructure. We realized that that was one of the issues. Also contributions by volunteer staff. Many of the grassroots organizations are basically being led through the contributions of people that are not paid. The level of financial resources in total, you think of mainstream organizations may have $1 million budgets, and some of the smaller ones working with a much smaller financial sort of situation. And whether people at the organization or program, where relevant of course, felt that they held similar experiences, had similar identities as the people that they're working with or who are accessing their services. So I'll talk a bit more about this later, but these are some of the things that really came up through discussions and also through reviewing the literature. We undertook this study using a mixed methods approach. Mixed methods, thinking of qualitative methods, for example, which include interviews, focus groups, maybe ethnographic methods being one of the things that we wanted to involve, and also quantitative methods, being able to look at numeric data, survey information. So really having this kind of mixed methods approach, but all of it driven through a community dialogue framework. And I'll describe what that really is about here. So from the beginning, in terms of thinking about what the research questions were, thinking about how we would go about designing the questionnaire, survey, interview guide, we started to reach out to people in the community. We reached out to people in our kind of internal networks, people that work at YouthREX across the province, and we also reached out to people that were in our external networks. We reached out to youth outreach workers, some of the funding organizations, other youth serving organizations, to be able to start the conversation around what the questions we should be asking are, and also as we developed our survey, as we developed our questionnaire survey, for them to be able to reflect on the questions and see if it made sense. So that was one aspect. The same was true also for the interview guide. The study was based on these two tools in terms of collecting data. The community dialogue approach is also based around the whole idea of trying to get at different perspectives. In this study, we were asking really one person from most of the organizations if they could sort of provide feedback on what their experiences with evaluation. So perhaps that was one area where I believe actually as our team discussed the findings, we always talked about how complex it is to talk about evaluation from one person's perspective. But in terms of who we involved, there were people at the front lines, there were people that were management staff, there were people with directors or executive director experience. So we had that kind of difference of perspective in terms of what we gathered. Analyzing, integrating data and research, we reached out to people again. As we started to develop our initial findings, we held a Knowledge Mobilization Expo in March last year in York Region in Markham, and we had about 60 participants from, again, sort of service providing organizations, funding organizations, capacity building organizations come together to start to think about some of the findings. So that was a part of the process of trying to refine and get a better understanding of what it all meant. And of course, where we are right now, which is to start another type of discussion, to be looking at the more refined findings with the understanding that it still can be built upon in terms of our conversation. So we welcome the people that are joining us in terms of participating and providing feedback, and we definitely welcome people to provide feedback over the next coming months as we sort of share the results in different venues. Okay, so here are the research objectives for the study. I've sort of touched on them briefly before. First was to get a sense of what are the particular, some of the nitty-gritty evaluation strategies, methods that are being used across the youth sector. Of course, with the comparison, trying to think about, are there differences? Are there things that are happening in more well-resourced organizations versus, say, others that may be working with smaller resources? The second was to get a sense of what are the organizations, what are the perspectives of organizations around doing different types of methods. So what's happening in regards to using surveys, art-based initiatives, art-based approaches, developmental evaluation, all these different aspects that people are talking about often, just getting a sense of what people are doing. Thinking about the strengths and gaps in research and evaluation capacity across the sector, thinking about some of the areas where other types of organizations can contribute, whether they're post-secondary institutions or funding institutions, and to get a sense of what are the opportunities and challenges with just doing the evaluation, and then finally thinking about what are some of the promising practices in the sector, as well as thinking about the ways that youth are engaged to participate in doing evaluation themselves. So these were the research objectives that we had. The study, as I mentioned, was based on really two big sources of data. One was an online questionnaire survey that was distributed last spring across the province, and we collected about 243 questionnaires, of which 197 were complete and included in the study. And of those, about half were defined as grassroots and about half were defined as mainstream. And just a note in terms of the collection, the way we did it, we used service contact data from Find Help information services, and also what you could consider sort of a snowball method. We would send the survey out to our colleagues and ask them to pass it along. We did it through our regional offices. We basically passed this information along as well as we could. So I'll just describe some of the characteristics between the mainstream and grassroots organizations here. So first of all, if you look at the location part of this table, this is using the census's definition of what a small, medium, and large population center are, and then based on the places where we received the surveys, just kind of cross-referencing to be able to describe that. So more of the grassroots organizations that responded in the survey were in smaller centers, but overall larger population centers were the places that people were responding from. In terms of their status, there were more mainstream organizations that were incorporated nonprofits, that were charitable organizations, but overall we're basically looking at a mixture in terms of some not being charitable organizations or nonprofits, or in the case of projects that are not registered as well. There weren't any mainstream organizations that were identified as such, but grassroots organizations. In terms of their history of financial arrangements, about 40% of the grassroots organizations had no core funding, and we defined kind of what no core funding was in the survey. And more of them, close to 1 in 5, had their finances trusteed by another organization. That is, another organization was responsible for managing their financial resources at some point in time in the last 3 years, I believe it was. And mainstream organizations, about 1 in 5, had acted as a trustee for another group, which I think is an indicator of some sort of financial status, I guess you could say. In terms of staffing, about half of the grassroots organizations reported that more than half of their work is being done by volunteers. I know it's a bit of a confusing sentence, but the idea there being that volunteers are a very important contributor to the smaller organizations. The staff size was it was smaller, and I'm reporting here on median staff size, but the staff size was smaller, and there were many more, they relied much more on part-time staff. This is the average percent of all their staff who are part-time, so close to 70% with the grassroots organizations, but this is also a situation in mainstream with close to 50%. In terms of youth-led, those that define themselves as being youth-led, we made a couple distinctions. One is that self-identified youth leadership in terms of the organization. About a third of the grassroots youth serving organizations identified as such. And when you look at the other aspect, which is really board, in the case where there's a board, that was actually higher among the mainstream. So mainstream organizations tended to have more youth member on their board of directors. And this is only reporting where there was a board, because obviously in terms of a project or so on, that wouldn't be the case. So I think that was an interesting finding as well. The survey was distributed across the province, as I mentioned. If you look in terms of our different areas, we had about 4% that were coming from Northwestern Ontario, close to 4% in Northeastern Ontario, about a third were received from Eastern Ontario, about 40% were from Central Ontario, and about 16% were from Southwestern Ontario. So I think this was fairly, I can definitely say I felt it was province-wide, but I think this is fairly reflective of population distribution across the province and the service distribution. So I think there's something there of value. In terms of the socio-demographic characteristics of the people who did the interviews, I'll just spend a moment there. Just to remind you about the interviews, we developed these guides through conversations with different organizations, service providers, funders, and so on, and the interviews themselves were done by the Institute for Social Research at York. So they did in total 60 in-depth interviews with managers and so on in their organizations. These were about an hour long. They really provided a lot of rich information about some of the different issues that people are experiencing. And I'll show some of that information as we go on. So in terms of the people that filled in who did the interviews, about 40% were from large organizations, about 20% from medium, and about 40% were from small organizations. There was a kind of balance in terms of people that identified as either male or female, and about 3% who identified as not being part of either gender. I'm being told that I should launch a poll. So actually, I'm going to launch one of the polls. This poll is asking the question as to what is your role in your organization, just so we can get a better sense of what type of roles people are doing. So 68% of the people that are on this call voted, and about 40% said that they design youth programs, and about 15% said they deliver youth programs, and 40% say they design and deliver youth programs, which is kind of one of our findings in a way, the whole part about people having to wear many hats in terms of their work. So those are the results of the poll. Okay, back to this. So in terms of the key informant interviews, this slide shows the breakdown in terms of where people were where they were working. So again, we reached out across the province. This was done through more of a reputational approach. We basically contacted organizations and got a sense of who would be great to talk about evaluation, having that expertise. We had, I think we oversampled in the north. We had, for example, 10 interviewees in northeastern Ontario and 7 in northwestern. About 20% of the interviews were done with people that work in Eastern Ontario, about 20% from people in Central Ontario, and about 20% from Southwestern Ontario. This bubble graph shows the breakdown in terms of their positions. So you can see the results in regards to that. I won't spend too much time on that. Okay, so these are the two data sources, and hopefully we can have a discussion later on about, some of those things. Maybe you can ask me questions after or during about the methodology. So based on these two, both the interviews and the questionnaires, we came up with some key messages after we did the analysis. There were 5 key messages that really integrate the findings. Our attempt here was to look at the quantitative data and the qualitative data and find areas where they triangulated, where they sort of spoke to each other. And we used that to develop these key messages. So I'll go through each one and provide some data to support as I go through. Okay, the first key message of 5. The findings indicate that youth sector organizations understand the benefits of evaluation and are enthusiastic about doing it. So this finding is really that as we sort of reached out to organizations, this is data from the questionnaire, that we really didn't see much distinction between mainstream and grassroots organizations regarding their interest in doing evaluation, their belief that evaluation could benefit their work. It was definitely the kind of majority viewpoint. That in and of itself is problematized later in different ways, but just to make that point, that people see evaluation as being something that's worthwhile doing, that's valuable, and can help to improve programs and youth outcomes. Here's a quote from one of the interviews. This is a person that's working in a large organization in Central Ontario, obviously anonymized. And I'll just make one comment about the qualitative data as well. All of the research we did went through ethics approval at the 5 universities that we partner with as YouthREX. So this quote, every quarter, 4 times a year, we do a satisfaction survey with our clients. That report is analyzed, compared with previous quarters to see what is the level of satisfaction, if there's something that needs to be improved. Then a plan is developed at the next quarter. We are hoping that when the evaluations come in, that they will have addressed that particular gap that was identified by these participants in the previous year. So this quote really speaks to both the doing of something that's evaluative and also the idea that this work is going to be used to make improvements moving forward. Second key message, there is an urgent need for evaluation processes and practices that can make evaluation less burdensome and more efficient for programs. So this was definitely an issue that comes up. And I think for those of you that are working in the sector, this is an issue that you probably hear all the time in different contexts. Doing evaluation, reporting on the results can be very challenging, especially if the situation is such that you don't have a dedicated person to do that work. So this is where we saw some differences as well in terms of the mainstream and the grassroots. Many more of the grassroots respondents felt that having volunteers was kind of key to help with their evaluations, but across the board, again, that there's not enough financial resources, that there's not enough staff time to do the work. And this was particularly true for grassroots organizations. Another quote, this is from a medium-sized organization in the Central Ontario region again. I think my key criticism of funders is that they never actually come down and see what we're doing. They're not really engaged with the organizations that they're funding. It becomes sort of a checkbox. Yes, they got their report, and they got their annual report, and they got their budget back and spending. They don't really understand the impact we're having. So this point being that the kind of distance and sometimes, well, I'll just say distance around the work that's being done in evaluation and the people that are doing the work. I think this was something that comes up in different ways. Third key message, youth programs and the broader youth sector may be missing the opportunity for evaluation to inform strategic learning. So evaluations meant to inform learning, program evaluation at the program level, but there's also this valuable information that can be documented through evaluation that can help to make larger decisions, not just decisions at the organizational level, but also even decisions that have more of a systemic, that may be able to reflect and address the systemic issues. For example, the majority of respondents reported wanting their organization to develop the capacity to link evaluation results to their strategic planning, employee work plans, to develop more capacity to analyze and interpret data, to report and communicate evaluation results. Here's another quote. This is from a large organization in Southwestern Ontario. It sort of feels like there's a view that if you have the most kids signed up for a program, that it's a successful program, when it actually says nothing about what the program is doing. If you were to look at those numbers as compared to other organizations in the city, it would look like we're serving less children in those programs. But perhaps we're serving them in a better way. Again, this speaks to one of the dilemmas that many face when things start to be reduced to numbers. The fourth key message, youth involvement in evaluation is important for youth well-being, but doing this meaningfully is still a work in progress. So in terms of this, both mainstream and grassroots organizations definitely felt that this was challenging. It was definitely apparent also in terms of the qualitative. But at the same time, there's like a real interest in being able to do it. So for example, close to 3/4 felt that you should be involved in evaluation activities. How you do that, of course, being the open question. And there was also a point around the distrust, the level of distrust among youth. And I think that has to do with the way that evaluation is discussed, incorporated, and also done. It can be done in ways that actually can be more empowering, and there's other ways where it can create sort of distrustful or questionable relationships. Here's a quote from a medium-sized organization in Northwestern Ontario. I think youth engagement and evaluation is really, well, the box is our addition. I think we added youth engagement and evaluation is really important because it gives them a sense of leadership. It's also really helpful in communicating the impact of our programming in a stronger way. We've been talking about working with our youth to do a video workshop to share a visual evaluation of the program. It's also them creating the evaluation in an artistic way. So again, thinking outside the box in terms of evaluation, thinking about ways to make it engaging. I think that this is not only for youth, this is something that all of us probably would like to see being done, but that person responding was sort of showing an alternative way of doing evaluation that could be more engaging. Key message number 5, the distinctive characteristics of grassroots youth service organizations when compared to mainstream organizations require a distinct understanding and approach to how these organizations engage with evaluation. The point here for me is really about, as we start to think more about the strategies to build capacity, sometimes within our own, at YouthREX, sometimes in collective conversations. It's really about thinking that there needs to be multiple strategies, there needs to be multiple ways of thinking about it, sometimes reflecting on regional differences, sectoral differences, and sometimes based on the capacities, resources, and the other things that people have on deck. Here's a quote from a medium-sized organization in Southwestern Ontario. Some funders' expectations for evaluative results are much more superficial or brief. They may just want some sort of attendance and satisfaction. Know what we're doing is a little bit innovative or new, and so we may sort of lean on that developmental evaluation approach and change our path a little bit to try and figure out what we can share with others. The point being that some of the richer types of evaluation, the ones that really help with organizations that are going through a lot of flux, programs that are transitioning and starting to maybe develop a stronger program model to build in evidence, actually require more effort. For example, developmental evaluation can require more effort, at least perceptive effort. You have to set up some sort of process in place to be able to collect data that you can be very responsive with to build, to constantly improve on programs and be, reflexive. So 10 recommendations that came out of the findings. The first 4 were for funders. The first was to embrace a contextualized evaluation approach. This really speaks to the whole issue of thinking about the very different needs of programs according to the things I've mentioned. Embrace a learning-focused evaluation model. We're starting to think about it less about testing whether something is working or not, whether an investment is meeting its financial objectives, but thinking about it more as these are all learning opportunities for all of us, a different perspective. Match evaluation expectations to realistic resource constraints, recognizing, for example, that the world we live in is largely based around program funding, and therefore there are timelines and rhythms to the way a program operates that can be very challenging to navigate in terms of evaluation. So sort of basing evaluation expectations on those realities. 4, streamline the reporting burden on youth organizations. I think that sort of builds on the last point. These were the recommendations for youth sector capacity building organizations, which is a mouthful, but these are organizations such as YouthREX that are doing work with the service providers, working with them to kind of figure out how they can to do their evaluations better, or in some cases, other systems that they're trying to support them with developing. Meet youth organizations where they are. Again, we think about this sometimes in terms of like physically where they are, conceptually where they are, all those different aspects are crucial. Provide opportunities for frontline staff to learn the fundamentals of evaluation. This is not only about deepening the ability to do evaluation in terms of having more of a team approach in programs, but it's also about providing opportunities for people who are working in frontline to understand some of the other discussions that are maybe happening at the policy level, to build up their own skill sets to be able to transition. So it really is partly about being able to create more equity in the sector and opportunities. Develop a strategy for supporting evaluation in Ontario's northern, remote, and rural communities. This recommendation really came out of the fact that in Ontario's southern regions, we have more universities, more funders are located here, more health institutions and others that have developed capacity building and learning opportunities. And the reality is we can access a lot of things that others can't. A webinar is great, but having that face-to-face can also be very helpful. So we have to think about how do we do that. Number 8 was to develop innovative, ready-to-use tools and encourage standardization, emphasis where appropriate. We're all in this moment where we're thinking about how do we have shared data? How do we have the information that's being collected at this program speak to information in other programs? It's a vision that I think is pretty widely held, but at the same time, it always leads towards some attempt at standardization. Standardization has its own costs, so we have to think about, is it appropriate to use standardized tools which may not be sensitive to some of the different things that are happening in programs that are maybe a little bit more innovative, or maybe might have unintended consequences that are equally important for us to examine. So being very careful about the selection of the way we go about doing this, but at the same time, one of the objectives being to make it accessible and easy. Okay, number 9. These were recommendations for youth programs, and it was to embrace an understanding that evaluation activities are part of youth work practice and incorporate evaluation activities into organizational learning and strategic planning. So this is more of the way that an organization or a program starts to think of the role of evaluation. And I think that this is not just for youth programs to consider, but it's more of a collective conversation. But starting to think about how can evaluation be built in across the board in different ways, involving youth and being used as an activity even to engage youth, being used as an opportunity to involve frontline workers in new learning and training opportunities and so on. Number 10, to keep thinking about how to meaningfully engage youth in evaluations of programs. Here I really think of the importance of that practice-based evidence. There is a literature on engaging youth in research, there is sort of some principles, but for me, I feel that only can go so far. It's always reductionist in nature. We need to be able to have conversations with people who have attempted different types of activities, who've innovated and adapted types of activities, and have found things that really work with different groups of youth. So I'm going to leave it there, but I do have one more poll that I would like to share. So this poll is asking the question, which of the following evaluation activities are the most challenging in the work you do? There's only one choice, but we really wanted to get a sense of, like, when you look across all the different things that happen in an evaluation, what are those things? And I believe I have opened the poll. Okay, so I'll stop the poll. So these are the different options that were laid out. One was developing an evaluation plan. The second was collecting data. The third was managing and preparing data for analysis. The fourth was analyzing data. And the fifth was writing reports and other materials from the findings. So the overwhelming results were around developing an evaluation plan. 45% of you said that was the most challenging part, and 33% said collecting data, and 15% said managing and preparing data for analysis, and 8% said analyzing data. So the report writing, on the other hand, was not listed as the most challenging thing. I think all of us in some way, shape, or form are obliged to write reports, but again, developing an evaluation plan was the most challenging. So I'm going to hand over the screen now, and we'll be giving some feedback from our panelists. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alexander, for sharing the findings. I think that this study is important to reflect on in this broader context because no study like this has ever happened in Ontario. It helps us to understand our work, but also as the 3 stakeholder groups were identified for the recommendations. The study does more than inform our work. It also gives important information, I think, to the different stakeholder groups, the funders, and youth programs. So that's very exciting. So at this point, I'd love to introduce today's panelists who come from different perspectives, will offer us different perspectives and come from different locations across and within the youth sector and intersect with this work in different ways. They're going to respond to the report findings that you've just heard and the recommendations and talk about how these findings resonate with their experience and context and how the findings can be meaningfully taken up. We asked our panelists to frame their comments around a series of questions which they've identified. Our first speaker is Jermal, Alleyne. I'll introduce them each individually. So Jermal is, it represents a youth program called Next Gen Men. Jermal is both the program director and the primary facilitator of an after-school program that works closely with parents, schools, and community partners. His commitment to Next Gen Men's mission comes from his professional background in public health and youth work, and as well from his experience supporting his family through mental health issues. I'll let Jermal speak a bit more about his context and how the findings from our report resonate with his work. Jermal is going to speak to 2 questions, which you can see. So welcome, Jermal.
Hi, thanks for having me here. So thanks, Rebecca. I guess my name is Jermal, and I'm one of the co-founders of Next Gen Men. So Next Gen Men is a nonprofit that is gender positive, and it focuses on building healthy masculinity with young men. Our mission is to engage, educate, and empower young men to be better contributors to their community. We have an after-school program that delivers 10 sessions to grades 7 and 8 boys for 2 hours once a week. And like Rebecca mentioned, I am the primary facilitator and one of the co-founders and program directors. So I already wear many hats, and we are a lean team of 3, where we have an executive director and Jason as well, who's our program manager. And they also have to wear many hats. We constantly have to worry about sustainability, project management, grant writing, and we also have to deliver the program at the same time. So we also run into that with our funding. There's not really much room for that evaluation piece to be on the forethought of our mind, because we're really worried about how to deliver the program the best that we can. So I'll give you a little bit of story about when we started Next Gen Men and how that went and how that leads to evaluation. So when Next Gen Men began, we understood that we would have to do some evaluation when we would do our pilot in our after school program, and that was in spring of 2015. So, but in the beginning, we didn't have an evaluation partner in mind, nor did we include the cost of having an evaluation partner in our initial budget. We and I didn't even know that how expensive it could be to have an evaluation partner or an organization do that for you. So when we first started thinking about evaluation, we had to think about the tools that we were looking at to answer our questions. And since we're not in academia anymore, these tools weren't very accessible to us. So we had to do a lot of networking to be able to find this. So when we did get that, after our networking, we found that masculinity, mental health, and homophobia were the things that we'd be studying. So it's great, we have these tools, but all we had to do was just throw them together in a pre-test survey. But I guess after then, it's what next? We get them to do the pre-test, we get the post-test. We don't know how to really analyze this. So we've been fortunate enough to be partnered with YouthREX, and they've been able to help us captivate and share our results with our funders. I think it would greatly help any grassroots organizations who apply for grants, that there'd be separate money to run the program, as well as the money for program evaluation to be part of it and provided for them. It would help the panic that we face in the early stages of Next Gen Men, and I know many grassroots organizations also face in the early beginnings. So one of the biggest recommendations that I got from the report was that it was number 3 into the funders. So matching the evaluation expectations to realistic resource constraints. I've been working in the youth sector for about 5 years now, and one of the issues that remains consistent is our resources continue to shrink with a growing expectation to do more. In one of my last positions as a case manager for an unemployment program, after our first year, we went from having 3 case managers to 2. So that increased our caseload from about 25 to 30 youth to 45 youth in our second year. So managing 45 of anything is tough. So imagine having to do this now with teenage at-risk youth who are often transient, dealing with personal struggles from mental health to issues at home. Often they were concerned more about how to get through their day-to-day than trying to keep a job and maintain it and be part of the program. But still, we were expected to successfully graduate X number of youth over a 10-month period. So one thing I hope that funders realize is that success is just much more than that number. It's about, for me at least, being a frontline worker in that sense, it was about how the youth gain the tools to deal with their day-to-day stress and mental health issues, about the coping mechanisms that they use to do that as well. Also attending school more regularly. Often these youth were coming to school once or twice a week, and after doing a program like this and meeting with someone, they attended school 3 to 4 days a week, and at times even 5. Then finally, just like finding a place to call their home for more than a few weeks. So these are issues that, or things that we saw as successful, but necessarily aren't there in the evaluation tools for us to measure at the end. And that's not a fault of the organization, but just something to consider for the future. So other gaps that we have noticed is that we're provided with resources that can affect change on a short-term basis. But really what we want is grassroots organizations. And I know that funders, who are people in the community as well, want us to see a lasting impact on the work that we do. And that starts from doing youth work all the way to their adult lives. So in our program, we provide knowledge, build healthier attitudes around concepts we discuss, and help to see change. We all know behavior is one of the hardest things to change, and when funding is only provided for a year, we kind of already know that we're doomed to fail. We are passionate about the work that we do, and we want to see a lasting impact, but when there's constant way of funding coming to a close, it doesn't make it easy to do our jobs. It would be great if we knew a funder would say, we work with you for 5 years because we know we can see behavior change then. So really, the funders kind of taking that approach of meeting us where we're at and doing this innovative work, knowing that we're new, knowing that we're innovative, and working with us throughout that process. Another issue that we had when we started this program is in start of 2016, the new sex ed curriculum kicked in, and this put a little pushback on the school administration. They were concerned about the programs they were letting into their school, and this delayed our program for 2 years. Or for 2 months, sorry. So after 2 months of not being able to actually do our programming, we're falling behind, and our evaluation is still expected to be the same. So having funders be adaptable as we've had to be adaptable with the social and political things that are going on in our everyday lives. So to address the issue of what I think is missing and what we should be talking about, I'm excited about evaluation. I love it. I think it's definitely necessary. I come with a public health background, so of course I want to see the things that I'm doing and that we are doing as grassroots organizations have an impact. But unlike health studies, usually that have funding for about 5 years, and even longer at times, we don't get to see the lasting changes or that behavior change over the long period. And I think that's something that we hope to see in the future. But what does happen is that these organizations that become good at what they do and they become the giants in the industry, they become the target for all of the funding and people put their faith in them. But meanwhile, our grassroots organizations are coming up with new innovative ways to meet youth where they're at, and they're just not able to get the funding there to do this work and then following the evaluation at the end. And the last thing I think to talk about is we talk about return on investment in business, but there's something called social return on investment, and I think that's super necessary in doing work in the youth sector. I think if we look at how we can improve our community over a long period of time and decreasing numbers in health costs, criminal justice, and if we had an evaluation partner that could really do this number for us when we set out to do our objectives in the beginning, this would really speak to funders and say, like, these people or these grassroots organizations are worth investing in. So I guess I'll leave it at that and turn it over to whoever is next in the panel.
Thanks so much, Jermal. That was so insightful and important. Really, I really heard your comments about how the grassroots is responsive, and so that you need your funders and partners to be as responsive, and the kinds of supports that you need to be able to evaluate. And additionally, the issue that you raised about timeframes, when we can expect to see impact and what impacts we can expect to see, and what we're able to measure of those impacts. Are they realistic and aligned with the kind of work that you're doing and experiencing in your day-to-day? The next person that I'd like to introduce is Betul Keles. She's the program manager at the Laidlaw Foundation, which funds grassroots youth organizations. Betul comes from a background in community development and political science, which she received her degree from McGill. At Laidlaw, she's in charge of overseeing grant-making activities and initiatives. So, Betul, I welcome you to respond to our findings and recommendations in the Beyond Measure report.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Rebecca, for the introduction, and thanks, Alex, for the presentation. So my name is Betul, and as Rebecca was saying, I'm a program manager at the foundation, responsible for overseeing our granting activities and initiatives. And so coming from that position, I can't really think of a report that's more relevant to our work at the foundation than this report. So really kudos to YouthREX team for all the work and time they put in it. And Laidlaw Foundation primarily provides support to youth-led grassroots, but also unincorporated informal groups who are not affiliated, with any organization, who may not have any organizational capacity at all to carry out evaluation. So I think this conversation is very valuable for us. In terms of the recommendations, I would say all recommendations are very valuable. We absolutely agree that evaluation deserves more time, attention, and resources than it currently receives. And it should be practical and focused on learning. And I guess, unfortunately, for some funders, numbers are more important, as they might paint a more telling picture for certain projects. But at the foundation, we're very receptive to qualitative evidence and the power of storytelling. And to be honest, if you're supporting social projects, then you have to be realistic about your expectations and be mindful that measuring social impact is not an easy job. And sometimes it requires you to be open to different methods and tools. So if you insist on numbers, you might be missing the point. And I think that's the key message for me that I get from this report. So the first recommendation is very valuable in that sense, providing the grantees with the flexibility and the resources to tell the story that they'd like to tell. And this requires deliberation with the grant recipients. And it's something that we're currently working on at the foundation. We recently had a focus group discussion with our grantees about the shared story that they'd like to tell about their work and the difference they're making, what matters in terms of measurement, how to build on their current data gathering processes, and to develop reporting process that works well for everyone. So it's a collaborative effort, and if there's any participants from a grant-making organization with us right now, I would be happy to connect with them and share my experiences so far. And I guess another recommendation that stood out for me is about streamlining the reporting burden on youth organizations. I found that really interesting, because I don't think any funder, at least not the ones that I know of, would be willing to place undue administrative burdens on their grant recipients. But again, it's something that we come across on our grant reports often. The groups mention reporting takes away from their energy required to implement the projects. And I understand, coming from a funding agency, I understand the frustration, but then I'd like to remind everyone that, reporting is mostly for learning for us, and we've created grant reporting documents with the help of our past and current grantees. And we believe that, these documents help us gain valuable insights into the projects we've supported. So maybe that's something that YouthREX might take on in the future, how to streamline those reporting requirements, because there are so many different stakeholders with different expectations. So if there's an answer to that, I'd like to know. Yeah, and one of the findings that stood out for me, and that's going to be my last remark, the report talks about the appetite for evaluation in the youth sector, and honestly, that hasn't been my experience. But I'm very happy to hear that, there's a very positive perception of evaluation in the sector. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the next presenter.
Thanks so much, Betul. I appreciated hearing from you and your perspective at Laidlaw, and it's really interesting. I'd love to hear more about how what you learned from working with your organizations about how to create tools that are responsive to their contexts. And I hear you in your interest about what would streamlined evaluation look like, and how could we design evaluations that support multiple learning outcomes for funders and organizations both. Next, I'd like to welcome Alison Stirling, who doesn't work directly with the youth sector, but works in a parallel capacity building organization called Health Nexus. Alison provides support and expertise in fields of health promotion and information management. She also supports the HC Link program and finding and applying practice and research evidence and strategies that can help groups partner, plan, and evaluate collaboratively. She has more than 25 years of experience in community-based research and evaluation, doing a variety of things, which I will let Alison speak to directly. Now, Alison, what were your perspectives and your takeaways from the report?
Oh, I had so many takeaways from that report. I just resonates so much with our work at Health Nexus and HC Link in terms of the capacities of groups and the difference between that burdensome of trying to meet all of the rigor of measures and evidence, and at the same time being able to tell our story and be involved in innovative work that impact. So all through it, I was just going, yes, that's the work. So I'm going to step back a bit and explain a little bit. Health Nexus is a bilingual organization. We're a nonprofit group that supports individuals, organizations, and communities to strengthen their capacity to promote health. And the team that I work with is part of HC Link. It's one of our 3 organizations that form HC Link. And together we work with just community groups and organizations and partnerships to build healthy, vibrant communities, which is kind of broad. But basically it comes down to what I do is help people and in organizations, communities, and as individuals to find what they need to be effective in their work and how to show the impact of that being effective. So it's really a challenge of both combining, what are your issues and concerns, and then being able to help refine that. So it's a capacity building of using creative and practical approaches to help define an issue, find resources and evidence, choose actions, and tell that story that can reflect and evaluate what's happening and then making an impact on change. And I think that's what, is it a constant one? Is it often where the consultants who come in freely, to work with a group to help do that, but it's a short-term thing, very much like our projects often are. So it's come in a short point, and that we work with big institution organizations such as CAMH or public health and social housing groups, and small grassroots organizations in peer sharing groups, coalitions, and partnerships. And as mentioned, in some youth sector groups on harm and poverty reduction, food systems, and more. But I'm going to give an example of some of the things that I worked with and why this report sounds so familiar to me, because I've worked on both sides. I worked with the Canadian Best Practices Portal as part of the Public Health Agency of Canada over 3 years of helping them to look at rigorous criteria to evaluate what makes the best, promising, or innovative programs. But hardly any grassroots group would ever meet those standards of a peer-reviewed, published evaluation. And that was sort of came back to where were we starting when we were starting at the wrong point, because it was the 3 weeks that I spent working with a newcomer immigrant group on civic engagement that really showed what made an impact and what was a best practice. Every time that we met, that group and I met with in doing it, there were guided reflections on hard questions. Why, who, what worked, didn't work, learning to change, and all of it was recorded and shared with everyone involved. It was a really participatory process that generated that data. And it opened my eyes to what was really showing that an impact. The problem was that wasn't considered data or the evidence that was accepted by the funder or as an example of a best practice. And then that was really something that went, but we're trying to make some changes. So that's why I was thinking, when I read that report, it just jumped out in terms of how we try and recognize how to look at rigor of measures and evidence often throws off the way of telling a rich and nuanced story. And so the two things that I want to look at, the recommendation that makes the biggest difference in my work and as a capacity building organizations is to meet the grassroots youth organizations where they are with their unique contexts, stories, and capacities. That was recommendation number 5. And also as part of that, the opportunities for people who are working in capacity building organizations to learn about the social and political realities and the context of evaluation. We need to take the time to learn about the situations that face student groups and not just jump in and problem solve to find quick answers in a short consultation. After all, we're building others' capacities to evaluate beyond what a funder might want to hear or what we ourselves want to hear. And at the same time, we need to build our own capacity to listen and learn through evaluation. So as the Ontario Nonprofit Network learned in developing a sector-driven evaluation strategy, they said that basically it's important to make sure that the evaluation approach you use fits well with your context. And I have to say the report which we went through just repeated that kind of thing. We have to look at the context, what happens, and to ensure that the evaluation approaches kind of meet that. So my other part of looking at what could improve our experiences of evaluation is something that we've been learning at HC Link in terms of focusing on providing the tools that could help, innovative, ready-to-use tools, but that address participation. So we were looking at the power of reflection as a recent tool. It takes a participatory evaluation approach to peer sharing, co-learning, and co-production. And basically, we're taking a systematic approach that can be the just looking more at what the situations are and how we work with it. So, and then that systematic approach can ask exploratory questions, powerful evaluative ones. And we've, in that power of reflection, it is a resource which I'm offering as a handout later on, is we suggest begin with what we can learn through evaluation, recognize when and how we're doing evaluation informally within a group or between people who are reflecting on plans and priorities. And I think one of the things that we usually do is that we think that we can't ask those questions not only informally, that it doesn't make a difference. We can use those powerful questions through standard data collection techniques like surveys and focus groups, key informed interviews as that part of that, and mixed methods. But we need to emphasize participation throughout our evaluation work, as well as when we're analyzing our results of our research. And we can certainly see with that YouthREX has done that, taken that exactly that approach, and I think that's really helpful. We need to emulate it much more within our own organizations. And then just to finish, like what we found is that when an example, what happened coming out of a meeting is that a couple people leave a meeting or organization talking about what happened in that, what happened in our project. That's lost data and analysis. It's more like when we work together in that, it's systematically reflect, evaluate, and find our story together. We're strengthened through it. And so I think that's what we're seeing is that we can use this report to also help us reflect on our culture and values and tell a story about how the evaluation can make a difference. So I'll leave it there and go on to hear from John.
Thanks so much, Alison. Your comments really resonate with us. I like your last comment about how do we integrate evaluation more naturally into our working cultures and find the story of our impact together. The word story has come up, I think, in all of our presentations so far, but now we'll pass it over to Dr. John Hodson, our last speaker from the day. Dr. John Hodson is joining us from Thunder Bay and from the Maamaawisiiwin Education. Dr. Hodson is of Mohawk descent and Turtle Clan. He has worked in Aboriginal education at the primary, secondary, and post-secondary levels in Canada and internationally for over 20 years and has published widely on the subject. At Maamaawisiiwin, Dr. Hodson provides leadership to this independent, non-aligned center of inquiry that offers culturally appropriate teacher development programming and research services to both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities. Welcome, Dr. Hodson, and I'd like to turn it over to you and ask what resonates with you from this report.
Miigwech. Bojo akmiensa nishnakas nadwe nene anara do dam Six Nations Dinjaba. Miigwech wendum to all of you who have organized this and included an Aboriginal voice. I guess if I was to begin with this first question, what resonated in the experiences in the youth sector in our region, one of the things that concerns me is that we don't often recognize that there are literally two epistemologies or two worldviews in this country. And epistemology drives practice. It drives belief in values and that are part of that practice. So when we look at research in the Northwest, and some of this is touched on in the report that I read, certainly there are not enough resources in the Northwest. But we live in an area that is predominantly Indigenous in nature. And I have to say that when I looked at the report, I was hard pressed to find anything that talked about Indigenous needs, which I think are extraordinarily different. Just talk about it geographically. We live in an area that's probably the size of France. And to get into some of our northernest, most remote communities, I could go to Europe and return at least a couple of different times. And they're fly-in communities, and there are no roads, or maybe winter roads, but no roads in the summer, and it demands flying in, and it's extraordinarily expensive. And this comes back to that idea of epistemic conflict. The dominant society has a dominant understanding of how research occurs, what it values and believes about processes, and what is valid evidence of success or lack thereof. And we look at things in a very different way. And I didn't see that embedded in the report, regrettably, because if this report is going to inform policy or inform governmental policy or funder policy, I don't think it's really served the needs of Aboriginal kids, the Aboriginal youth in this territory. We have particularly onerous situations in the Northwest, levels of violence, youth incarceration, youth suicide. Some of the literature talks about youth suicide that's 50 times higher than the rest of the country. So when you talk about Ontario, usually the voice that is talking comes out of the South and doesn't fully appreciate our situations in the North around the needs of our youth, nor do they fully appreciate the needs that are epistemic in nature associated that really drive research. So that sort of takes, I think, my first question. My second question is, how do you involve youth in evaluation? Again, it's difficult within the current funding regime, and I'll be clear that for the most part, our clientele, Aboriginal clientele, Indigenous clientele, rely on governmental funding that again, they have an epistemology and a certain way of practice that occurs that just is literally in conflict with the needs in our communities and how we do things. And because of that, it's difficult to involve youth in the way that would be culturally appropriate in the evolution of our youth. And I think in many ways this comes back to something that I've noticed, is that evidence-based decision making, whether it's at the funding level or the private or the public funding level, although it's as a philosophy of management is there and is call it the flavor of the month, I really don't think that the understanding of what that means has really filtered down into those institutions, so that what you don't see is the kind of deep understanding of what that means from an Indigenous perspective. And I think Jermal hit on it in a way that, in a similar way, in that they don't really understand what it is that we do, what we need to do, and how that can increase the capacities, the research capacities of Aboriginal youth. And because of that, there's no money to do that. And of course, if there's no money, it doesn't happen. Aboriginal research, because there's two epistemologies, the dominant society dominates what happens in research. Aboriginal research takes place in a very different context, and because it takes place in a very different context, is more expensive. However, what we don't recognize, or at least fully recognize, is that the dominant society understanding of evidence-based decision-making, research, evaluation is built around their values and beliefs, and including the financial realities of that are built around there. So when we compare, we're literally comparing apples and oranges. So everything around Aboriginal evaluation is seen as secondary because it's more expensive, just the geographic needs of trying to get into the Northwest as an example, because our methodologies may be different and are more elaborate in comparison to the dominant societies. They're seen as secondary and more expensive, and therefore why do you need to do it that way? So in many instances, what we find is that we're forced, because of financial realities, and our clients are forced to not include the realities, those realities in their funding and in their direction. Many times what we do is more elaborate than what in terms of government needs around what they consider to be good evidence. They, often that conflict comes down to bums and seats. They want head counts, and somehow head counts equal success in programming. And that's not often the case. You can put lots of bums in seats and have very dissatisfied heads, rising above those bums. So yeah, how do you involve more youth? Aboriginal youth, and I'm going to speak from an Aboriginal context for the most part. More money designated for research, whether it's yeah, I'll leave it at that. More money dedicated to Indigenous research in the way that Indigenous people need to do it. If you want to build youth capacity in that area, it costs money, and that's as simple as I can put it. What's missing from the findings? I think, and this is a criticism, well, perhaps a critique is a better word. It's not uncommon, for research that's been driven out of the South to leave out the voice of Aboriginal people. It is the norm, regrettably, and there is an assumption that, all youth are the same, so we talk about youth. We don't talk about the needs of Indigenous youth in specific that have very different needs and very different realities than perhaps the dominant society, the youth of the dominant society. So I'd say the voice of Indigenous people is missing often in the discourse around evaluation, around shifting practice to meet the need, evidence-based practice to meet the needs that are very relative to culture, on occasion lack of culture, and certainly relevant to the contemporary issues of Aboriginal people. So all the way around, it's not about the effects or the outcomes of research as much it's about the patterns that drive research and how we understand research. We need to start broadening our understanding, and I say that to funders, and I say that to government, deputy ministers and policy folk often, that we need to better understand what Aboriginal research is about. and fund it accordingly. And it's not about treating all youth the same. Equality doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is treated the same. And if you're looking at investing in one area that is struggling, I don't think you could look at investing in anything better than the realities of Aboriginal youth. Just statistically, more of our kids drop out before grade 12. A few of our kids get into post-secondary education at the standardized age. We have higher rates of suicide, higher rates of domestic violence, higher rates of incarceration, higher rates of substance abuse. I mean, the list is endless. So how do you take, all of this information and shape those realities around youth evaluation, or the evaluation of youth programming, and still make the same kinds of recommendations that are generic in their effect? And you'll never, by doing that, you'll never have an opportunity to shift the realities of Aboriginal people, because what will drive policy, what will drive funding, whether it's private or public, will be a dominant society's understanding of how evaluation is done and the acceptance of what's correct evaluation. It's epistemic in nature. The foundation of it is epistemic. It has always been such. And I actually gave, not long ago, Rebecca, a paper that I thought was an excellent paper. It's a little old now, but I don't think that matters anything. By a guy named Willie Ermine from the University, First Nations University of Canada in Saskatchewan. It's absolutely approachable. It's an easy read, but what it clearly does is delineate in a very clear, non-academic language what the difference of epistemologies are between the dominant society of this country and Indigenous people in this country. And it doesn't take a genius, once you see it all laid out, to sort of project and see how we project what is good research from a non-Indigenous perspective, and how that works. And you can immediately see the conflict between the two epistemologies, because they're literally on each side of a spectrum. So yeah, I guess that's all I'm going to offer at this point. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to speak, and say hello to everyone from beautiful Thunder Bay, Ontario. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Dr. Hodson. Thank you for your very powerful comments, and how you pointed out the limitations of the Beyond measure, and your comment and your prompts for us to do more work to understand what is an Indigenous perspective and how do we support that? How do we support it and understand it? And how, in fact, is that even part of the work of reconciliation? Your comments about how, and your insistence that it starts with an epistemic difference between a colonial, very Western view of what is knowledge, where knowledge comes from, and how we make knowledge, and the recognition that Indigenous approaches are different, and that if our report were to inform policy, it would need to take these into consideration, and it is an area for us to learn more, significantly more. So at this point, I'd like to just again thank all of the panelists and Alexander, and just review what we've heard, and then open it up to the people who are participating to ask some questions. So in the last hour, we've covered quite a bit of ground. We've talked about the challenges of matching expectations of evaluation with realities on the ground. We've asked what are the appropriate tools to do this, to meaningfully evaluate our impact, specifically, or in the context of work that is highly dynamic and responsive, in the context of work that is funded over the short term, but yet where long-term outcomes are sought. We've talked about the tensions between customizing evaluation and standardization. So the Ontario Nonprofit Network recent sector-driven strategy for evaluation was mentioned, and they also finding that it's important to match evaluation approach with context. And so that comes out, I think, very clearly. How do we do that? How do we match evaluation approach and context? And additionally, how does that work in relationship to some of our resource challenges that have been mentioned again and again? So I think that I'll start by offering a pretty broad question to all of our panelists. I think maybe first I'll go to Jermal and ask Jermal, how does an understanding of context change how we do evaluation? So if we understood your context, what kind of evaluation would support you and your work?
Yeah, thanks. I think if you were to understand the context of what we do, the evaluation that would definitely help is that it's always changing. When we're talking about doing work with young boys in regards to masculinity and all of that, social media plays a huge part in their understanding of what they're being told and then how they'll act. So something that we can always, like an evaluator that can continue to be up to date with that type of information would be helpful. And like funders definitely knowing that it's something that's going to change and will always be evolving. So to be cognizant of that and work with the like specifically our organization that is doing that work. And I was going to say the same thing for most grassroots organizations. We're trying to find new and innovative ways to engage our youth, and maybe just not our youth, but our community. And we look at what's new and what's there, and what might be there 6 months from now will be different from a year and a half. So just knowing that evaluation will be something that's always evolving and never stagnant. So for the evaluators who are listening, to kind of find tools that can always be changing, and I guess that standardizing of it might not work in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Jermal.
You're welcome.
Someone has written in a question, I think that Alexander can answer. It's specifically in with respect to one of our recommendations for funders, a recommendation that funders embrace a learning-focused evaluation. And the question is, what is a learning-focused evaluation?
Thanks. Thanks to all the panelists and all the comments. I think they're really powerful and important. To the question, I think a learning-focused evaluation is one where the information and the practice are closely aligned. So the information in terms of how people are responding to their needs or how the program is running is aligned to practice. So hypothetically, you could have a program where there's weekly check-in conversations that are constantly being built in. But I would define it as the alignment between practice and the research.
Thanks, Alexander. The next question, I think, might be best answered by Alison. So Alison, it's in relationship to the comment that Dr. Hodson made about the bums and seats phenomenon of counting outputs. So if you have any suggestions about evaluation that could get us to quality of programs, so beyond the bums in seats to the experience in the seats.
That's a really good question, because I think that's what we end up happening in most of the sector is having to provide the numbers and it not reflecting the impact, which is what we're really doing. And I'm thinking that the quality of the program, and instead of counting the numbers, is really going to be reflected in what we are doing on a regular basis. So I think there was a mention of doing, I think Alexander was saying, sort of there's weekly reflections, there's ways of doing it, sort of what's happened, what's really happened that we've learned, and what's changed at a small level. So the counting or learning what are the effects of our programs or activities or working with a group in each small way of counting, not the numbers who participate in something, but what the story of how one person or a group of people's lives have shifted as a result of that. So I'm thinking that instead of counting the numbers, we're counting the effects or the impacts, and both when things fail.
Mhm.
What did we learn from that? Not only the numbers of who comes there. So I'm saying that we should really look at that reflections, those guidance, and the stories of what is currently happening at a regular basis.
Thanks, Alison. I have a follow-up question about, someone has asked about social returns on investment. Have you ever done those?
I haven't been directly involved in those, the social return on investment. I know I worked with a group that was is pursuing that area of looking at what measuring that social return in regards to the change in situations, conditions of people's lives. So what happened in terms of both employment or housing or the shifting of their health conditions, and not those were the measures that they were using in terms of that return on investment.
Yeah, so the question is around social return on investment, and that is another like emerging framework for demonstrating impact.
Yes.
And it also has, going back to what Dr. Hodson said, roots in an epistemic kind of perspective. So I think that noting that and kind of holding that, I'd like to turn again to Dr. Hodson and ask Dr. Hodson, given your comments, you're rightly pointing out how evaluation does come in the way that it's talked about in dominant discourses does come from a particular world view. So how would you suggest managing different cultures and epistemologies and methodologies, given that like majority funders come from one paradigm and you're saying that Aboriginal communities come from a different paradigm?
Wow, good question. Let's see, I see that we have 48 attendees at this point, plus my fellow panelists and Alex and the two, Rebecca and there. So we probably got 60, 65 people. If I was to ask any one of you, tell me about your epistemology, what you would inevitably find is that very few of us could sit down and sort of speak to that in any depth. We literally enact epistemology. It's not a conscious understanding. It's something we learn at the feet of our parents, and it's reinforced through school and in our interactions with our kids on the block and our peers. And literally by the time we're 5, we are who we are. And we just keep replicating that in everything that we do. Aboriginal people are no different. We have a different epistemology. We learn it the same way, and we enact it in our lives. And it often comes into conflict in certain social situations, like education, in classrooms that are led by a dominant society teacher that are part of the dominant understanding of what education is. And the outcome is, statistically, that the vast majority of First Nations Indigenous kids in the province of Ontario drop out before grade 12. Now, you talked about SRI. If you just looked at SRI from the perspective of the number of dollars that are shifted from First Nations into school boards in the province of Ontario, and what the social return on investment is of the kids that drop out before grade 12, I think you'd have a startling piece of research right there. And social return on investment is not just about kids graduating at grade 12 and how many move into college and university or trades and then become part of the economic reality. But think about the social reality of kids coming off reserve to go to school. The vast majority drop out and go back into their communities with a sense of failure. Kids are programmed to learn. That's who they are. That's what they are. They're little sponges and they soak up everything, and that's the way things are. But you take a young person who, by the time in many instances are grade 6, 7, 8, are determined to drop out of school because it's totally irrelevant to them, and then go back into their community as failures. And we lose literally a decade, for the most part, of energy, of employability, of innovation from that population of kids in that community. They are in their own minds failures. So the social return on investment in that instance is stunning, and yet nobody's talking about it in any way, shape, or form, or as a research piece. Okay, let me get back to your first question. How do we change that reality? We have to become more conscious of how our patterns of thought, our epistemologies, affect our practice, how they build structures within our society, and then we have to ask ourselves, are those structures effective, and do we need to make change with them? So, for whether it's individually, for all the people that are listening to my voice now, or whether it's collectively, the balance of Canada, if we don't start having a better, deeper conversation about what it is those structures are and how the patterns of thought create the structures, then what we will continue to do is replicate the same failures over and over and over again from generation to generation. And I think that's not only a non-Indigenous reality, it's also an Indigenous reality. Unless we start asking ourselves what it is that what patterns of thought do we have that create the structures in our communities, whether First Nation, whether rural or urban or remote, we will continue to replicate those activities, those systems in our lives over and over. So it really behooves the researcher, the funder, the program leads to start asking those very critical questions. What are the values and beliefs? What are the epistemic underpinnings of that drive what it is that we do? And to see through those epistemic understandings or patterns of thought, how those systems that are evolved and are created, and then in turn, what are the success of those patterns of thought, those systems on the populations that we work with. A classic understanding of that is, from a research perspective, is the notion of objectivity. We hide ourselves in the terminology. We talk about data, we talk about analysis, we talk about objectivity, and all these things are just an attempt to try to play games in our head to somehow separate ourselves from who it is that we're working with in a research context, with the notion that, well, if we're separated from the people that we're working with in research, somehow we'll get a better understanding of what it is that they're doing. I think that's a really, tell me, just fundamentally, somebody tell me how you become objective. How do you literally step outside of yourself in a research perspective? And then alternatively, let me ask, what makes you think that the people that we work with can not or are unable to represent their realities if somehow you don't, you're not objective and you have a relationship with them? It really is a paternalistic mindset that says, no, these people need us to be behind some sort of blind of a terminology so that they can, we can study them in their natural kind of environment. I think it's a really bad, all the way across the line. It really is bad. So until researchers, until funders start asking those serious questions, especially around Aboriginal evaluation, what it is that drives our decisions, what it is that drives what we value, what we believe in the realms of funding, in the realms of research, we're not going to make any difference in this country. We'll just keep replicating the same outcomes. And I think it was Freud that said something to the effect of, crazy, the definition of crazy is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. Miigwech.
Miigwech. Thank you for your provocative comments and insights and challenges to all of us to participate in this work of understanding this. And just a plug for a future webinar. I know that our colleague in Thunder Bay, Carly Brochi, our hub manager there, is organizing a webinar that focuses on approaches to evaluation. Some people have asked to learn more about this, but we will be focusing a webinar on this in June, so stay tuned for that. We're getting close to the end of time. There are a lot more questions. I think I'll just end with one, and I'd like to offer it to Betul, who I haven't asked a question to yet. So Betul, this question is about, I wonder if you could speak to your experiences around effective strategies for promoting community buy-in prior to engaging in an evaluation. And so I think in your context, you work with groups of grassroots youth organizations. Has Laidlaw promoted community buy-in to your evaluation approaches?
Hi. Well, seeing the stakeholders, the grantees as partners, and deconstructing that unfortunate power relationship that exists, in your relationship with your grantees. So as I've mentioned in my talk, we're currently actually carrying out a developmental evaluation, and we're not even calling it an evaluation. We're calling it a strategic learning exercise, where we get together with our grantees and ask them to tell us about their challenges and the opportunities or, whatever it is that they'd like to share with us. And then we take that input and then we try to integrate that input in our strategic direction. So I think, approaching the community from a learning perspective, as long as there's a learning piece in it, I think people would be very receptive to evaluation.
Thanks so much. And we are over time, so we're going to have to sign off for now and continue this conversation in different places and forums and with other people in our lives. You can continue the conversation with us here at YouthREX, absolutely, through Twitter, through emails, through our website. We are going to send out an evaluation form of this webinar to all participants, and we'd love to know how you experienced the webinar today. Just a couple of notes. Some people have asked about resources. Some of our guests mentioned resources and references that will be helpful to understanding their comments a bit more. So both Alison and Dr. Hodson had offered some resources, and we will be sharing those with everyone in our webinar recap. Look for those there. And then also before we sign off, we'd just like to let you know that this webinar and this study is kicking off kind of a mini series of webinars that will focus on digging deeper into some of the different recommendations that came out of this study and their implications for us and our work here at YouthREX, so you can learn more about those. Our next one is the end of this month, April 27th, and we'll be talking about our approach to evaluation and the model that we've created that we believe is responsive, or it strives to be responsive to youth sector needs. And then the following webinars will be on our evaluation process, how we do our work, and another technical piece on indicators and tools that we can use to understand the outcomes of our work. And like I said just a couple minutes ago, in June we'll be having two webinars, and one of those will be hosted and led by the Northwest Hub in Thunder Bay, and it's going to be about Aboriginal approaches to evaluation. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone so much. Thank you for participating. Thank you for sharing your perspectives on this important work and for joining the conversation and making it that much richer. See you all next time. Thanks so much.